Part 1: The Carpet and the Queen. The Mediterranean sun hung low over Alexandria's harbor on that October afternoon in 48 BC, casting long shadows across the war-torn city. Smoke still rose from the shattered remnants of the Pharos lighthouse's lower quarters, where skirmishes between rival factions had left their mark. The greatest city of the Hellenistic world, home to the legendary library, the museum, and 500,000 souls, had become a powder keg of dynastic ambition and civil war. Gaius Julius Caesar, 52 years old and Consul of Rome, stood in the commandeered royal palace overlooking the harbor, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. The chambers were opulent beyond anything in Rome, walls adorned with lapis lazuli and gold leaf, floors of polished marble that reflected the dying light like water. Yet for all its grandeur, the palace felt like a gilded cage. Outside its walls, 20,000 Egyptian soldiers loyal to the boy King Ptolemy XIII had the palace surrounded, their bronze-tipped spears glinting in the sun. Caesar had arrived in Alexandria with only 4,000 legionaries, pursuing his defeated rival Pompey the Great across the Mediterranean after their decisive clash at Pharsalus. What he'd found instead of his enemy was a gift wrapped in tragedy: Pompey's severed head, presented by the eunuch Pothinus and the boy king's advisors, who'd thought to curry favor with the victor by murdering the vanquished. They'd miscalculated catastrophically. Caesar had wept at the sight, whether from genuine grief for his former son-in-law or theatrical outrage at the murder of a Roman consul. No ancient source could definitively say. But the tears were real enough, as was his fury. Now he was trapped, a fox in a henhouse of vipers, playing a dangerous game with Egypt's squabbling royal siblings while his own forces were stretched thin across the known world. His lieutenant Mark Antony held Italia. Brutus and Cassius administered the provinces. But here, in this corner of Alexander's old empire, Caesar stood alone with his small force, caught between the Mediterranean and an increasingly hostile Egyptian court. The doors to the chamber swung open, and Apollodorus the Sicilian entered with swift, purposeful strides. The merchant was young, perhaps 30, with the sun-darkened skin of one who'd spent his life on trading vessels. His eyes held the calculating gleam of a man who dealt in more than silk and spices. Information was his true currency, and tonight he carried the most valuable commodity of all. "Consul," Apollodorus said, inclining his head with precisely measured respect, "not too deep, not too shallow. The item you requested has arrived, but its delivery requires discretion." Caesar turned from the window, one eyebrow arched in that familiar expression that had unnerved Senate opponents for decades. "Show me." What Apollodorus revealed was not what most men would expect. Two burly sailors carried a rolled carpet into the chamber, their muscles straining under the weight. It was a magnificent piece, Persian or perhaps Anatolian work, with intricate geometric patterns woven in crimson and gold. But it was the unusual length and careful handling that drew Caesar's attention. This was no mere gift of textile artistry. "Set it down," Caesar commanded. His hand moved instinctively to the dagger at his belt, a commander's reflex never dulled. The guards flanking the entrance shifted forward, their gladii half-drawn. Apollodorus knelt beside the carpet and, with theatrical slowness, began to unroll it. Silk and wool unfurled across the marble floor in waves of color. And then, emerging from the fabric like Aphrodite from sea foam, came Cleopatra VII Philopator, Queen of Egypt. She was 21 years old, and history would spend 2 millennia debating her beauty. The truth, as Caesar saw it in that moment, was more complex than mere physical appearance. Cleopatra was not the ethereal beauty of Helen of Troy, not the sculptured perfection of a temple statue. Her nose was prominent. Later Roman coins would show this clearly. Her chin was strong, almost masculine. But her eyes were quicksilver intelligence, burning with an intensity that transformed her entire face. And when she spoke, rising from the carpet with the grace of a cat, her voice carried the weight of 8 generations of Ptolemaic rule and 300 years of Macedonian Greek culture transplanted to African soil. "Gaius Julius Caesar," she said in perfect Latin, brushing carpet fibers from her Greek chiton. "I apologize for the unconventional entrance. But my brother's troops guard every gate, and a queen cannot afford to be turned away when she seeks audience with the master of the Roman world." Caesar found himself smiling, genuinely smiling, for the first time in weeks. The sheer audacity of it. She'd been smuggled past an army, rolled up like merchandise, gambling everything on the chance that he would hear her out rather than hand her over to her brother's executioners. "Most petitioners use the door," he observed, dismissing his guards with a wave. They hesitated. Leaving the consul alone with an unknown quantity was tactically unsound, but they obeyed. Caesar had survived ambush, mutiny, and assassination attempts for 3 decades. If this slip of a girl posed a threat, their swords wouldn't stop what was coming. When the doors closed, the two of them stood alone in the fading light, 2 people who would reshape the ancient world staring at each other across a carpet that still held the warmth of her body. "Doors can be closed," Cleopatra replied, moving to the window he'd vacated. She looked out at the harbor, at the ships bearing Roman eagles, at the city that was her birthright and her prison. "I needed to ensure you would hear me. Not my brother's eunuch Pothinus, not the general Achilles, not the tutor Theodotus who counseled them to murder Pompey. Me. And what does the Queen of Egypt wish to say?" She turned to face him fully, and in that moment, Caesar saw beyond the clever entrance and the desperate gambit. He saw exhaustion in the dark circles under her eyes, saw the tremor in her hands that she couldn't quite suppress. This was a woman who'd been driven from her throne by her own family, who'd raised a ragtag army in Syria only to watch it disintegrate, who'd spent months as a fugitive in the deserts beyond the Delta. This was someone who'd lost everything and was making one final throw of the dice. "I wish to tell you the truth," Cleopatra said simply. "Not the lies Pothinus feeds you about restoring order and securing Egypt's friendship with Rome. The truth is that my brother is 13 years old and controlled entirely by his regents. The truth is that Pothinus and Achilles murdered Pompey not out of loyalty to you, but to create chaos, to ensure that Rome stays mired in civil war while they consolidate their power. The truth is that they're already corresponding with your enemies, hedging their bets, waiting to see if you survive long enough to matter." Caesar settled into a chair carved from Lebanese cedar, inlaid with ivory and gems. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, pacing now with nervous energy. "And why should I believe you?" he asked, though he already suspected most of what she said was accurate. His own intelligence had hinted at treachery in the Egyptian court. "You have everything to gain from turning me against your brother." "Because I can prove it," Cleopatra shot back. "The correspondence exists. Letters sealed with the royal cartouche, written in Pothinus's hand. I can deliver them to you. But more than that." She paused, and her voice dropped to something raw and honest, stripped of political calculation. Because I'm the only one in this whole poisoned city who'll tell you the simple truth. They're planning to kill you, Caesar. Tonight, tomorrow, as soon as they think they can do it without triggering a Roman invasion. You walked into a trap when you landed here, and every day you stay, the news tightens. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant shouts of soldiers on the palace grounds, and the eternal crash of Mediterranean waves against the seawall. Caesar studied her with the gaze that had evaluated 1,000 battlefields, reading terrain and enemy intentions in the slope of a hill or the formation of troops. What he saw in Cleopatra was something rare, genuine fear married to genuine courage, desperation tempered by intelligence. She was terrified, but she was thinking. That made her dangerous. It also made her potentially invaluable. Sit, he said again, this time with more warmth. You've had a long journey, I imagine. Apollodorus, he called, and the merchant appeared as if he'd been listening at the door, which he probably had. Wine. The good Falernian I brought from Brundisium. And food. The queen looks like she hasn't eaten properly in days. As servants bustled in with refreshments, Caesar watched Cleopatra's facade crack just slightly. She'd been running on nerve and willpower, he realized. The girl was half-starved, exhausted, probably terrified that this gambit would end with her strangled by a silk cord in some back room of her own palace. Tell me everything, Caesar said as she finally sat, as she finally allowed herself to accept the wine with shaking hands. Start at the beginning. When did your brother's regents first move against you? And so she talked, and he listened, and the night deepened over Alexandria. She told him of her father, Ptolemy XIII, the flute player, a weak man who'd bought his throne with Roman gold and left his children a kingdom drowning in debt. She described the will that named her and her younger brother co-rulers, a Ptolemaic tradition that everyone knew was merely formality. Egypt had never truly accepted a female pharaoh alone, not since Hatshepsut 1500 years before. She spoke of the power struggle that erupted within months of their joint coronation 3 years earlier. How Pothinus the eunuch, Theodotus the rhetorician, and General Achillas had isolated her, poisoned the boy king's mind against her, claimed she was trying to rule alone in violation of their father's will. How they'd driven her from Alexandria a year ago, how she'd fled to Syria and tried to raise an army from the desert tribes and displaced mercenaries. I made it as far as Pelusium, she said, staring into her wine cup as if reading omens in its depths. We camped there, on the edge of Egypt proper, ready to march on Alexandria. But my forces were inadequate. Poorly trained, poorly supplied. And then news came that Pompey had lost at Pharsalus, that you were pursuing him east. The whole calculation changed. My allies melted away like morning mist. Everyone wanted to wait, to see which Roman would triumph before committing to either side of Egypt's civil war. Practical, Caesar observed. Cowardly, Cleopatra corrected, with sudden vehemence. Egypt is not some game piece on a Roman board. We are the oldest civilization in existence, Caesar. We were building pyramids when your ancestors were living in mud huts. The Library of Alexandria holds the wisdom of centuries. Our granaries feed the Mediterranean. We are not some prize to be awarded to whichever side shows more strength. Caesar smiled at the fire in her voice. And yet here you are, seeking Roman backing for your throne. Here I am, she agreed, meeting his eyes, acknowledging reality. My family has ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, but we are Greek foreigners on an African throne. We control the coast, the delta, Alexandria itself, but the true Egypt, the Egypt of ancient traditions and temple priests, has never fully accepted us. We need legitimacy. We need power that goes beyond mere military force. And like it or not, Rome now bestrides the world like a colossus. I can hate that fact, or I can work with it. I choose to work with it. With me, you mean? With you, she confirmed. If you live long enough to matter. Which brings us back to the immediate problem. Pothinus intends to murder you, probably within the next few days. He's gathering forces under the command of Achilles. They'll claim some pretext, securing the city, responding to a threat from your legions. But the real plan is to storm this palace and cut your throat before reinforcements can arrive from Syria. Caesar leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The intelligence matched his own scouts' reports. He'd been walking a tightrope since arriving in Alexandria, playing the neutral arbiter between sibling rulers while quietly shoring up his defenses. But 4,000 men, no matter how well trained, couldn't hold against 20,000 indefinitely. You risk much coming here, he said. If I were to turn you over to your brother, it would buy me time. Might even secure my safe departure. But you won't, Cleopatra said with certainty that surprised even her. Because you didn't weep over Pompey's head out of sentiment. You wept because his murder was dishonorable, because it robbed you of the magnanimity of pardoning him, because it was done by foreigners to a Roman consul. You have many faults, Gaius Julius Caesar, the world knows them all, but you understand honor. You understand that some prices are too high to pay, even for survival. The accuracy of her reading shook him. This girl had studied him, perhaps for years, preparing for a moment she must have known would come eventually. She knew his campaigns in Gaul, his clemency toward defeated enemies, his calculated generosity that turned foes into allies. She'd learned the lessons that Rome's own Senate had failed to grasp, that Caesar was most dangerous not when he fought, but when he forgave. Perhaps, he said carefully, we can help each other. And there it was, the beginning of everything. Not love, not yet. That would come later, in the months of siege and intimacy, in the long nights of planning and the desperate days of fighting. But in that moment, as the last light faded over Alexandria and the lamps were lit throughout the palace, two of the ancient world's most remarkable minds recognized each other across the gulf of culture, age, and gender. They talked through the night, plotting strategy. Caesar would declare himself the executor of the late Ptolemy XII's will, would summon both royal siblings to appear before him for arbitration. It would force the issue, bring the conspiracy into the open. Cleopatra would stay in the palace under his protection. Her very presence would enrage Pothinus and might provoke him into a premature move. They'll lay siege, Cleopatra warned as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. You'll be trapped here. I've been trapped before, Caesar replied. At Alesia, I built walls facing two directions, one to keep the Gauls in their fortress, one to keep their relief army out. I held. I won. These palace walls are stronger than anything I had in Gaul. This isn't Gaul, she said softly. This is Egypt. The desert, the delta, the Nile itself, they fight for us. And my brother's advisors know this land in ways you cannot. Then it's fortunate, Caesar said, rising and extending his hand to her, that I'll have an advisor who knows it better than anyone. She took his hand, and the gesture sealed more than a political alliance. In that touch, in the warmth of his weathered palm against her smooth fingers, lay the seed of something neither of them had anticipated. She'd come seeking a protector, a military force to reclaim her throne. He'd been prepared for another scheming Eastern monarch, another piece to move on the great game board of Mediterranean power. What neither expected was to find an intellectual equal, a kindred spirit who saw the world not as it was but as it might be shaped by sufficient will and vision. As Cleopatra was shown to chambers where she could finally rest, where guards loyal to Caesar would keep her safe from her brother's assassins, she looked back once at the Roman consul who held her fate in his hands. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me yet," Caesar replied. "The siege hasn't started. The dying hasn't begun. Thank me when we're both still alive and you're sitting on your throne." But he was smiling when he said it, and so was she. Two gamblers who'd each bet everything on a single throw, recognizing in each other the same reckless courage, the same refusal to accept defeat. Outside, the sun rose over Alexandria, gilding the harbor in light. And in the palace, ancient gears of history began to turn, grinding toward a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the ancient world and create a legend that would echo through 2 millennia. The game had begun. Part 3. The Nile Journey ***. Winter passed into spring, and with it came a transformation of Alexandria from war-torn battleground to something resembling normalcy. Markets reopened, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence as Roman patrols ensured order. The harbor crews began the slow work of clearing wreckage from the Great Fire, salvaging what could be saved, mourning what was lost forever. And in the palace, 2 monarchs who'd been enemies learned to share power, though everyone knew which sibling truly held authority now. Ptolemy XIII, humbled by defeat and stripped of his poisonous advisors, proved surprisingly malleable. He attended state functions, performed ritual duties, signed documents placed before him. But real power resided with Cleopatra, and increasingly, with the Roman consul who showed no signs of departing Egypt despite the siege's end. Official dispatches from Rome lay unanswered on Caesar's desk. Reports of unrest in Pontus, of remaining Pompeian forces regrouping in Africa, of political maneuvering in the Senate, all of it ignored while Caesar remained in Alexandria, seemingly content to let the wider world spin without him. The Senate grumbled. His enemies whispered that Egypt's wealth and Cleopatra's charms had seduced him from his duty. Mark Antony, holding Italy in Caesar's name, sent increasingly urgent letters asking when the consul would return to address Rome's mounting problems. Caesar read these dispatches with detached interest, and filed them away without response. He had his reasons for staying, though he confided them to no one but Cleopatra. Egypt was the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean, its grain harvest feeding Rome itself. Whoever controlled Egypt wielded enormous power over Rome's food supply, and thus over Rome's politics. Caesar needed to ensure that control rested with a friendly, stable regime, which meant ensuring Cleopatra's position was unassailable before he departed. That was the political calculation, the official justification. The truth was more complex, and it lived in the hours they spent together as winter gave way to spring. They would meet in the evenings after the day's administrative duties were complete, ostensibly to discuss policy and governance. Caesar taught her Roman law and military organization, the mechanics of Senate politics, the delicate balance between populace and optimates that had defined his entire career. She taught him Egypt, not the Egypt of Greek Alexandria, but the ancient Egypt that stretched back 3,000 years, the Egypt of temple rituals and hieroglyphic mysteries, of a civilization that had been ancient when Rome was still a collection of mud huts on 7 hills. "You Romans think you've conquered the world," Cleopatra said one evening, as they reviewed plans for rebuilding the library. They sat in her private study, a chamber lined with scrolls that had survived the fire, lit by oil lamps that threw dancing shadows across papyrus and parchment. "But you're children compared to Egypt. We were already old when your Romulus killed his brother and founded your city. We had already risen and fallen and risen again while your ancestors were still learning to work bronze." "And yet," Caesar replied, leaning back in his chair with a cup of wine, "Egypt fell to Alexander of Macedon, and your family rules by right of conquest, not ancient bloodline. Even the oldest civilizations can be overthrown by younger, hungrier powers. Is that a threat?" But she was smiling as she said it, the lamplight catching the intelligence in her dark eyes. "It's an observation. Nothing lasts forever, Cleopatra. Not kingdoms, not empires, not even the gods themselves if we believe the old stories. Everything that rises must fall. The only question is whether it falls to chaos or transforms into something new. And you think Rome is that transformation? That your city of wolves and fratricides will somehow transcend the cycle that brought down every empire before it?" Caesar set down his wine cup and leaned forward, his face suddenly serious. "I think Rome has a chance. Not because we're better or nobler than those who came before, we're not. We're brutal and greedy and we turn on each other like rabid dogs. But we have something others lacked. We absorb. We take the best from everyone we conquer and make it Roman. Greek philosophy, Carthaginian naval tactics, Gallic metalwork, Egyptian administration. We're a civilization built from pieces of every culture we've encountered, held together by discipline and law. And by the gladius," Cleopatra added dryly. "And by the gladius," he acknowledged. "I won't pretend otherwise. But the sword only conquers. What comes after? The roads, the aqueducts, the laws that apply equally to citizen and provincial, the peace that lets merchants trade from Britannia to Syria, that's what might let Rome endure where others failed." She studied him in the lamplight, this man who was simultaneously poet and killer, scholar and soldier, who'd written commentaries on his campaigns in prose that would be studied for centuries while wading hip deep in the blood of enemies. "You're a paradox," she said finally. "You speak of peace and order, yet you've spent your life making war. You talk about law while ignoring the Senate's authority. You claim to serve the Republic while amassing power that makes you more king than consul." "I contain multitudes," Caesar replied with a slight smile. "As do you. You're a Greek ruling Egyptians, a woman wielding power in a world of men, a scholar who learned to think like a general when survival demanded it. We're both creatures of contradiction, you and I. Perhaps that's why we understand each other." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something unspoken. They'd been dancing around it for weeks now, the attraction that had grown from intellectual respect into something more heated, more dangerous. Cleopatra was 21, Caesar 52. She was a queen, he was married to Calpurnia back in Rome. Every possible obstacle existed to prevent what both of them increasingly wanted. And yet, "I'm planning a journey," Cleopatra said, breaking the moment, turning back to her papers with studied casualness. "A royal progress up the Nile to Thebes and beyond. I need to show myself to Upper Egypt, to remind the priests and nobles that their pharaoh survived the civil war and sits secure on her throne. The journey will take months. We won't return to Alexandria until summer. A wise move politically, Caesar agreed, following her lead and pretending nothing had just happened. Secure your position in the south while your brother remains here under Roman protection. I'd like you to accompany me. The words hung in the air between them. This was no longer political calculation. This was an invitation to something that would scandalize both their worlds, that would give Caesar's enemies and Rome ammunition for their attacks, that would bind them together in ways neither could fully predict. Caesar should have refused. He should have made excuses about duty, about the need to return to Rome, about the impropriety of a Roman consul traveling as companion to an Egyptian queen. He should have recognized this for what it was, a point of no return, a threshold that once crossed would change everything. When do we depart? He asked. They left Alexandria in late March, as the spring floods began to swell the Nile, and the desert bloomed with brief life. The royal barge was a floating palace, 400 feet long and 60 feet wide, propelled by banks of oars and steered by pilots who'd learned to read the river's moods from their fathers who'd learned from their fathers going back generations. The vessel's deck was shaded by awnings of purple silk. Its hull was painted with scenes from Egyptian mythology, Isis and Osiris, Horus and Set, the endless cycle of death and rebirth that defined Egyptian cosmology. Caesar brought a small personal guard, a century of his most trusted legionaries commanded by Rufio, the centurion who'd played traitor so convincingly during the siege. Cleopatra was accompanied by her household staff, her body servants Iras and Charmian, and a delegation of priests and nobles whose presence gave the journey official legitimacy. But everyone knew the truth. This was not primarily a political journey. This was a retreat from the world, a stolen interlude where two of the most powerful people alive could exist simply as man and woman, freed temporarily from the weight of history and expectation. The journey up the Nile was like traveling backward through time. Alexandria was Greek, Mediterranean, cosmopolitan, a city that could have been anywhere in the Hellenistic world. But as they sailed south, Egypt's ancient heart revealed itself. Villages built from mud brick unchanged in design since the age of the pyramids. Temples with columns thick as ancient trees, their surfaces carved with hieroglyphs that even Cleopatra's scholars struggled to fully translate. Peasants working fields with wooden plows that differed not at all from those depicted on tomb walls 3,000 years old. Caesar, who'd conquered Gaul and seen wonders from the Rhine to the Atlantic, found himself awed. "It's like the land itself remembers," he said one evening as they stood at the barge's rail, watching the sun set over fields of green wheat. "As if time moves differently here." "Egypt is eternal," Cleopatra replied. "Kingdoms rise and fall, dynasties come and go, but the Nile floods every year, and the people plant and harvest, and the cycle continues. My family may be foreign conquerors, but we serve something older than conquest. We serve the rhythm of the river and the land." They stopped at Memphis, the ancient capital, where pyramids older than history dominated the horizon. Cleopatra made offerings at the Temple of Ptah while Caesar wandered among monuments that made Rome's greatest buildings seem like yesterday's work. He stood before the Great Pyramid of Khufu, already ancient when Herodotus visited it, already a wonder of a lost age, and felt something rare for him, genuine humility. "We're mayflies," he said when Cleopatra found him there, staring up at 2,000,000 tons of precisely cut stone. "All of us. You, me, Rome, Egypt. We're all mayflies dancing for a day while these things endure." In another 3,000 years, will anyone remember Caesar? Will anyone care about the civil wars of Rome, the dynasties of the Ptolemies? But these, he gestured at the pyramids, these will still be here. Is that what you want? Cleopatra asked softly. To be remembered? To leave something that endures? Isn't that what everyone wants? To matter, to leave a mark, to prove that our brief moment of existence meant something? He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw a vulnerability he rarely showed. I've conquered nations, Cleopatra. I've defeated enemies who thought themselves invincible. I've changed the course of Roman history, for better or worse. And sometimes I wonder if any of it matters. If I'm just rearranging furniture on a ship that's sailing toward oblivion regardless of what I do. She took his hand, a simple gesture, but the first time they touched intentionally, intimately. It matters because we make it matter. Yes, we're temporary. Yes, everything we build will eventually crumble. But while we live, we shape the world for those who come after. Your laws might outlast your name. My children. She paused, the word hanging between them with sudden significance. Might rule an Egypt that synthesizes the best of both our worlds. We plant seeds we'll never see flower, Caesar. That's not futility. That's hope. That night, after the official ceremonies and political audiences were complete, after the servants had withdrawn and the barge lay quiet on the Nile's gentle current, Caesar came to Cleopatra's chamber. No words were spoken of permission or propriety. What was between them had moved beyond such considerations. Their union was both inevitable and revolutionary, a Roman consul and an Egyptian queen, products of wildly different cultures, separated by 3 decades of age, finding in each other something either had expected to find. For Cleopatra, Caesar was liberation from the narrow role her world prescribed. He treated her as an intellectual equal, sought her counsel on military matters, valued her mind as much as her beauty. For Caesar, exhausted by decades of political warfare and increasingly isolated by his own success, Cleopatra was rejuvenation. Her youth, her passion, her absolute certainty that she could reshape her world, it reminded him of what he'd been before ambition and violence had hardened him into the calculating instrument he'd become. The affair that began that night would scandalize Rome and delight Caesar's enemies. It would produce a son, Caesarion, little Caesar, whose very existence would threaten the political order. It would entangle Roman and Egyptian destinies in ways that would ultimately lead to civil war, the end of the Republic, and the transformation of the Mediterranean world. But in that moment, as they came together in the darkness of a barge floating on the oldest river in the world, they were simply 2 people who'd found each other against improbable odds. 2 souls who recognized something kindred across the vast distances of culture and experience. The journey continued through the spring. They stopped at Thebes, where the temples of Karnak and Luxor stood as testimonials to Egyptian power at its zenith. Cleopatra performed the ancient rituals, presenting herself to the priests as true pharaoh, legitimate heir to a tradition stretching back to Narmer and the unification of the 2 lands. Caesar watched these ceremonies with the eye of a student, seeing in Egyptian religion a complexity and sophistication that challenged his assumption of Mediterranean cultural superiority. Your gods are more human than ours, he observed after watching a ceremony where Cleopatra played the role of Isis, ritually mourning and resurrecting Osiris. They love and hate, they die and are reborn. Our Roman gods are distant, transactional. We sacrifice and they grant favors, but there's no relationship there, no real connection. Because your gods didn't create Rome, Cleopatra explained. You borrowed them from the Greeks, who borrowed them from older cultures still. They're adopted gods, not native ones. But the Egyptian gods are Egypt. They're the Nile's flood and the desert's heat and the crops growing in black soil. When I perform those rituals, I'm not praying to distant beings. I'm embodying principles that have sustained this land since before human memory. Do you believe it? Caesar asked. Truly believe it? The mythology, the divine right of Pharaohs, the eternal return? She considered the question carefully. I believe in the power of belief. Whether the gods are literally real or metaphors for natural forces, does it matter? The belief shapes behavior, creates social cohesion, gives meaning to suffering and purpose to celebration. You ask if I believe Isis literally gathered the pieces of Osiris and brought him back to life. I say it doesn't matter if she did. What matters is that story has sustained Egypt through invasions and famines and plagues for 3,000 years. That's power, Caesar. That's magic more potent than any spell. They traveled further south than any Roman had ventured, past the first cataract to the edge of Nubia, where Egypt's traditional borders blurred into African vastness beyond. Here, the river became wild and untamed, crashing over rocks and rapids that forced them to portage the barge's cargo around impassable sections. Here, temples gave way to frontier fortresses, and the comfortable certainty of Egyptian civilization yielded to something older, darker, more primal. Caesar loved it. After months of political maneuvering and careful diplomacy, the frontier's raw honesty refreshed him. Danger was straightforward here. Crocodiles in the river, lions in the brush, bandits who struck without warning and cared nothing for Roman authority or Egyptian divine kingship. It was combat reduced to its essentials: kill or be killed, survive or perish. One afternoon, as they explored a ruined fortress from the Middle Kingdom, they were caught in a sudden sandstorm. The sky turned orange, then brown, then nearly black as wind-driven sand reduced visibility to arm's length. The barge was miles downriver. The ruins offered minimal shelter. Caesar's guards formed a protective circle, shields locked against the stinging sand, but it was clear they couldn't remain exposed for long. Cleopatra grabbed Caesar's arm and pulled him toward a half-collapsed doorway. Inside! There's a chamber underground. I saw it when we were exploring. They descended crude stone steps into darkness, feeling their way down as the storm howled above. The guards followed, and for long minutes they huddled in blackness while the desert raged. Someone managed to light a torch, and in its flickering glow they found themselves in a tomb, ancient even by Egyptian standards, the hieroglyphs on the walls weathered nearly smooth, the sarcophagus that had once held its occupant long since looted. Well, Caesar said, shaking sand from his hair, at least the last occupant won't complain about the intrusion. Despite the danger, despite the discomfort, Cleopatra laughed. It was so absurd. Two monarchs hiding from a sandstorm in a robbed tomb, surrounded by soldiers trying not to show their nervousness at being trapped with the dead. The laughter was contagious, spreading through the group until even Ruffio's stern legionaries were grinning. I think, Cleopatra said when the laughter subsided, I've never been happier than in this moment. Trapped in a tomb during a sandstorm, covered in sand, with absolutely no control over the situation. It's rather liberating. Caesar understood perfectly. For these few months on the Nile, they'd been freed from the weight of who they were. No Senate breathing down his neck, no court politics poisoning every interaction, no endless calculations of advantage and risk. Just the river, the land, and each other. The storm passed after an hour. They emerged to find the world scoured clean, the air crystal clear, the setting sun turning the desert into a sea of gold. And as they made their way back to the barge, both of them knew this interlude was ending. Reality was reasserting itself. Caesar had been away from Rome for nearly 6 months now. His enemies would be strengthening their positions, his allies wondering if he'd abandoned them, the political situation deteriorating with every week of his absence. They began the journey back to Alexandria in late April. The return trip was faster, flowing with the current rather than against it, but the mood was more somber. Both of them felt it, the weight of responsibility settling back onto their shoulders, the knowledge that what they'd shared on the Nile would be subject to harsh scrutiny in Alexandria and harsher still in Rome. "I'm pregnant," Cleopatra told him one evening, as they sat watching the sun set over the river one final time. "I'm certain of it." Caesar absorbed the information without visible reaction, though his mind immediately began calculating consequences. A child would be both gift and weapon, proof of his virility at an age when many men were declining, but also a vulnerability his enemies could exploit. More importantly, it tied him to Egypt in ways no political alliance could match. "A child of two worlds," he said finally. "Neither fully Roman nor fully Egyptian. What kind of life will such a child have?" "The life we make for them," Cleopatra replied fiercely. "I won't let this child be a pawn, Caesar. Not in Roman politics, not in Egyptian dynastic struggles. This child will be raised to understand both cultures, to bridge the gap between East and West, to be something new. An heir to both empires," Caesar mused. The idea had dangerous appeal. He had no legitimate son, his marriage to Calpurnia had produced no children, and his only acknowledged child was his daughter Julia, long dead in childbirth. A son, even an Egyptian son, would be. He stopped himself. This was exactly the kind of thinking that had led to civil war in Rome, that had turned the Republic's institutions into empty shells as powerful men competed for supremacy. He'd promised himself he wouldn't become what his enemies accused him of being, a would-be king, a tyrant in waiting. Yet here he was, contemplating dynasty in all but name. "We'll protect this child," he promised. "Whatever else happens, whatever political storms come, we'll keep them safe." It was a promise he would not live to keep, though he couldn't know that then. Couldn't know that in less than 4 years he'd be dead on the Senate floor, murdered by men who claimed to be defending the Republic. Couldn't know that his will would name not Caesar Ion but his grandnephew Octavian as his heir, setting in motion a conflict that would doom both Cleopatra and their son. Couldn't know that his attempt to remake the Roman world would succeed, but in ways he never intended and through hands other than his own. But on that evening on the Nile, as spring gave way to early summer, and the barge carried them back toward Alexandria and all its complications, ignorance was a kind of grace. They had the moment, and the moment was enough. They reached Alexandria in early June to find the city transformed. The fire damage had been repaired, trade was flowing again, and a certain normalcy had returned. Ptolemy XIII had governed adequately in Cleopatra's absence, proving that stripped of his poisonous advisors, he was capable of basic competence. The people seemed content, or at least resigned to the new order. But Rome could not be ignored forever. The dispatches waiting for Caesar were urgent almost to the point of hysteria. Pharos II of Pontus had invaded Roman territory, defeating Caesar's legate and threatening to undo all of Pompey's eastern conquests. The Pompeian remnants in Africa were regrouping under Cato and Scipio, building an army that would require attention. And the political situation in Rome itself was deteriorating. Without Caesar's presence to arbitrate disputes, the delicate coalition he'd built was fracturing. "I have to leave," he told Cleopatra the night after his return. They were in her chambers, having dispensed with any pretense of propriety. "Pharos is first. I can deal with him quickly. Then Africa, which will be more difficult. Then Rome, to sort out the political mess and prevent everything I've built from collapsing." "When?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Within the week. I've delayed too long already." She nodded, her hand moving unconsciously to her still flat belly where their child grew. "I'll miss you. These months, they've been the happiest of my life, I think. Certainly the freest. And the most dangerous for your kingdom," Caesar added with characteristic bluntness. "You've allied yourself with me completely now. If I lose, if my enemies triumph in Rome, you'll be isolated and vulnerable. Your brother might take courage from my defeat and move against you again." "Then don't lose," Cleopatra said simply. "You've never lost before. Don't start now." Caesar laughed despite himself. "Such confidence. I hope it's warranted." "It is. You're Gaius Julius Caesar. You don't know how to lose. It's simultaneously your greatest strength and most dangerous weakness." She was more right than she knew. Caesar's absolute conviction in his own success, his inability to conceive of defeat, would ultimately make him careless. Would lead him to dismiss warnings about the Ides of March, to enter the Senate without guards, to die in the most humiliating way possible for a man who'd conquered nations, cut down by lesser men wielding daggers, bleeding out at the feet of Pompey's statue in bitter irony. But that was still years away. For now, in the summer of 47 BC, Caesar was still triumphant, still ascending, still reshaping the world according to his vision. They made love that night with desperate intensity, as if their bodies could communicate what words couldn't, the fear that this might be their last time together, the certainty that what they'd shared had changed them both irreversibly, the hope that somehow, despite all the obstacles, they might find a way to build something lasting from the passion born on a carpet-smuggled entrance and nurtured through war and journey. Caesar departed Alexandria 5 days later, taking his legions and leaving Cleopatra secure on her throne. He would defeat Pharnaces at Zela in a 5-hour battle so decisive that he'd reported to Rome with his famous phrase, "Veni, vidi, vici." I came, I saw, I conquered. He would crush the Pompeian remnants in Africa after a harder campaign. He would return to Rome in triumph, showered with honors that barely concealed the reality. He had become what the Republic most feared, a man whose power transcended the Republic's institutions. And through it all, he would remember Alexandria. Would remember the woman who'd emerged from a carpet with audacity and intelligence that matched his own. Would plan for a future where Rome and Egypt were united not through conquest but through alliance, where their child might inherit a Mediterranean world transformed. It was a beautiful dream. Reality would prove far bloodier. Part 4. The Roman Triumph ***. Caesar returned to Rome in the autumn of 46 BC, nearly 2 years after leaving Alexandria, and the city he found was both familiar and utterly transformed. The physical landscape remained unchanged: the 7 hills, the Tiber's muddy flow, the Forum's ancient temples. But the political terrain had shifted beneath the feet of those who thought they understood Rome's fundamental nature. The Republic, in any meaningful sense, was dead. What remained was theater, a performance of constitutional government staged for an audience that increasingly understood it as fiction. For triumphs were decreed by a Senate that had lost the will to deny Caesar anything. For separate processions to celebrate his victories over Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. The triumphs were spectacular beyond anything Rome had witnessed. Floats depicting the Nile and pyramids, exotic animals from Africa, captive kings and nobles walking in chains, wagons groaning under the weight of plundered treasure. The people loved it, roaring their approval as Caesar rode through the streets in a chariot painted gold, dressed in Jupiter's regalia, a laurel crown on his thinning hair. But there were whispers too, darker currents beneath the celebration's surface. The triumph over Egypt was particularly controversial. Roman tradition held that triumphs were granted only for victories over foreign enemies, not for civil wars or victories over other Romans. Yet everyone knew that Alexandria had been as much about defeating Ptolemy XIII's faction, backed by Romans and Roman interests, as about any foreign conquest. Caesar had carefully framed it as a victory over Egypt's treacherous advisors, as the restoration of legitimate monarchy, but the framing fooled no one with eyes to see. More scandalous still was the statue. Caesar had commissioned it for the Temple of Venus Genitrix, which he'd built in the new forum he'd constructed with the spoils of his conquests. The statue was ostensibly of Venus, the divine ancestor of the Julian clan. But the face was Cleopatra's, unmistakably, deliberately so. Egyptian features, that prominent nose, the slight smile that could mean anything. It was a declaration visible to all of Rome. The Egyptian queen was under Caesar's protection, was part of his vision for the future, was to be honored as a goddess in Rome's most sacred precincts. The conservative faction in the Senate was apoplectic. Cato would have given speeches for days had he survived the African campaign, but Cato had fallen on his sword at Utica rather than accept Caesar's clemency, becoming in death the martyr the traditionalists needed. Without him, the opposition lacked a voice of absolute moral authority, but the resentment festered nonetheless. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator who'd managed to survive the civil wars through careful neutrality and rhetorical brilliance, visited Caesar shortly after the triumphs. They met in Caesar's house near the Forum, not the modest dwelling of his youth but a mansion appropriate to his status as dictator. The title had been granted by the Senate, for the regulation of the constitution, theoretically temporary but everyone knew would be renewed indefinitely. "The statue is a mistake," Cicero said without preamble. He was 60 years old now, his face creased with lines earned from decades of navigating Rome's treacherous political waters. "I speak as a friend, Caesar, when I tell you that Rome is not ready to worship a foreign queen in the guise of Venus." Caesar poured wine with his own hands, a gesture of respect for Cicero's age and accomplishments. "Rome worships gods from all over the Mediterranean, Marcus. Cybele from Phrygia, Isis from Egypt. In their own temples, with their own rites," Cicero interrupted. "Not in the Forum, not bearing the face of a living woman, not commissioned by the man who holds supreme power in Rome. The symbolism is too clear. It suggests ambitions that cannot be spoken openly." "Kingship," Caesar said flatly, naming what Cicero wouldn't. "That's what you mean. You think I aspire to be king, don't you?" Cicero set down his wine untasted. "Dictator perpetuo, commander of all legions, architect of new laws, builder of new forums bearing your name. You've accumulated more power than Sulla dreamed of, and you show no sign of relinquishing it. What am I supposed to think? What is anyone supposed to think? Caesar was silent for a long moment, staring into his wine as if reading auguries in its depths. When he spoke, his voice was tired, the exhaustion of a man who'd spent decades fighting and was beginning to wonder why. I think, he said carefully, that Rome's constitution is broken. Has been broken since the Gracchi, perhaps longer. The Senate represents only itself, only the interests of a few hundred families who've monopolized power for generations. The people have no real voice except through violence, riots, assassinations, civil wars. We lurch from crisis to crisis, and each time the solution is to grant emergency powers to someone who then refuses to give them back. Sulla did it. Pompey did it. Now I'm doing it. The pattern is clear, Marcus. The Republic isn't working anymore. So you'll replace it with monarchy? With Oriental despotism? I'll replace it with something that works. Caesar shot back, his patience fraying. Look at Egypt. 3,000 years of continuous civilization, Marcus. They've survived invasions, famines, plagues, dynastic struggles that would have shattered any other culture. You know why? Because their system is stable. The pharaoh is both king and god, the embodiment of Egypt itself. When the pharaoh is strong, Egypt is strong. When weak, new pharaohs arise. It's brutal but effective. It's tyranny, Cicero said quietly. It's order. And right now, Rome needs order more than it needs the fiction of senatorial authority. Caesar leaned forward, his eyes intense. I've walked through Gaul, Marcus. I've seen how our proconsuls govern the provinces, the corruption, the exploitation, the casual brutality that makes a mockery of Roman justice. I've watched senators vote against Rome's interests because of personal feuds or bribes from foreign kings. I've seen the Republic paralyzed by its own procedures while enemies gather at our gates. Something has to change. And you're certain you're the one to change it? That you won't simply become another tyrant, another Tarquin the proud to be overthrown by virtuous republicans? Caesar smiled without humor. I'm certain of nothing, old friend. But I'm going to try anyway. Because if I don't, someone else will, someone with less concern for justice, less mercy toward the defeated. At least I offer clemency. At least I try to build rather than simply destroy. Cicero left unsatisfied, as Caesar knew he would. The old Republican saw Caesar as the Republic's destroyer, unable to recognize that the Republic had destroyed itself long before Caesar was born. The civil wars, the proscriptions, the breakdown of legal norms, all of it had been building for a century. Caesar was symptom as much as cause. But that philosophical comfort didn't help with the immediate problem. Rome's elite feared and resented him in equal measure, and fear combined with resentment was history's most reliable formula for assassination. The warnings began subtly. A priest announced that he'd seen inauspicious omens, birds flying from the wrong direction, a sacrificial animal with a malformed liver. Caesar, who'd served as Pontifex Maximus long enough to know how such prophecies were manufactured, ignored them. Then came anonymous letters warning of conspiracies, of plots being hatched in the shadows. Caesar filed these away and increased his personal guard. What he didn't expect was Cleopatra. She arrived in Rome in the summer of 46 BC, traveling with full royal pomp and an entourage of hundreds. Officially, she came to negotiate a formal alliance between Egypt and Rome, to finalize trade agreements and settle questions about Egyptian grain shipments. Unofficially, she came because she was pregnant again, or rather, had been pregnant, having given birth to Caesar Ion the previous year, and wanted Caesar to acknowledge his son. Her arrival caused a sensation. Romans had seen foreign monarchs before, but never like this. Cleopatra came not as a supplicant but as a queen greeting an equal. Her barge on the Tiber was more magnificent than any Roman vessel. Her clothing combined Egyptian and Greek styles with a theatrical flair that both fascinated and scandalized. And she brought the child, little Ptolemy Caesar, called Caesar Ion, with his father's sharp features already visible in the baby's face. Caesar installed her in one of his villas across the Tiber, technically outside Rome proper to avoid questions of protocol. But everyone knew she was there. Everyone knew Caesar visited regularly. And everyone drew their own conclusions about what it meant that Rome's dictator had a foreign queen as his mistress, and a son who bore his name but not his legal recognition. The conservative faction found their rallying cry. This was decadence, they whispered. This was Rome becoming another Eastern despotism, ruled by a dictator who took a queen as his consort in defiance of Roman marriage laws. Marcus Junius Brutus, Caesar's former protege and possibly his illegitimate son, listened to these whispers with increasing concern. Brutus was 41 years old, a man caught between two worlds. He loved Caesar almost as a father. Indeed, rumors suggested Brutus might be Caesar's son by his affair with Brutus's mother Servilia decades earlier. But Brutus also loved the Republic with an idealist's fervor. He traced his ancestry to Lucius Junius Brutus, who had overthrown Rome's last king 5 centuries before. The weight of that heritage pressed on him like a physical burden. Cassius Longinus, another former Pompeian whom Caesar had forgiven, began approaching Brutus with careful questions. Had he noticed how Caesar accepted honors that bordered on divine? How he sat while senators stood? How he'd allowed statues of himself to be placed among those of the gods? These weren't the actions of a first citizen, Cassius suggested. These were the actions of a king in waiting. He saved Rome from chaos, Brutus protested. The civil wars would have continued for years without him. Pompey's faction would have carved up the provinces among themselves. At least Caesar brings order. Order at what price? Cassius pressed. Brutus, your ancestor freed Rome from tyranny. Are you going to watch while Caesar makes himself king and do nothing? He hasn't made himself king. He's dictator, yes, but a distinction without a difference. Come, walk with me. Let me introduce you to others who share our concerns. The conspiracy grew slowly, carefully, drawing in perhaps 60 men, all of senatorial rank, all with grievances real or imagined against Caesar. Some were Pompeians who'd never forgiven Caesar for defeating their faction. Others were Republicans who genuinely believed they were saving the Republic. Still others were simply opportunists who saw a chance to eliminate a powerful rival and redistribute his authority. Meanwhile, Cleopatra navigated Rome's social intricacies with the skill of someone who'd survived palace coups and civil wars. She held symposia in her villa, inviting Rome's intellectual elite, poets, philosophers, scholars. She spoke fluent Latin with a Greek accent that Romans found charming. She discussed philosophy with men who'd expected an Eastern barbarian, and found instead someone who could quote Plato and debate the nature of justice. She also worked to secure Egypt's interests. The alliance she negotiated gave Egypt favorable trade status, guaranteed Roman protection against foreign invasion, and subtly positioned Caesarion as a potential bridge between Roman and Egyptian interests. Caesar, watching her operate, felt both pride and something like fear. She was magnificent, intelligent, charming, ruthlessly effective. She was also making enemies with every success. "They hate me here," Cleopatra told him one evening as they dined in her villa. Caesarion slept nearby, watched over by nurses. "Your senators look at me and see everything they fear: foreign influence, Eastern decadence, a woman wielding power. Calpurnia, your wife, refuses to acknowledge my existence. Half the Senate won't attend my gatherings. I'm accomplishing what we set out to do, but the cost is making you vulnerable." "I've always been vulnerable," Caesar replied. "From the moment I crossed the Rubicon, I committed myself to a path that ends either in complete victory or complete destruction. There's no middle ground for someone like me. The Senate will never forgive my successes, will never accept the changes I'm forcing on them. Whether you're here or in Alexandria changes nothing essential. Then let me return to Egypt. Let Caesarion grow up away from this poisoned atmosphere. Come visit when you can, when your work here allows it. But don't keep us here as symbols for your enemies to target." Caesar knew she was right, yet he found himself reluctant to let her go. She was a reminder of those months on the Nile, of freedom and possibility, of a version of himself that wasn't worn down by political calculation and military necessity. When she was nearby, he could imagine a future that was more than just survival, a future where he might actually build something lasting and good. "Stay through the winter," he said. "There are laws I need to pass, reforms that will secure what we've built. I want you to see them enacted. Then, in spring, you can return to Alexandria. I'll visit when I can, when Africa is fully pacified and Hispania is settled." She agreed, though both of them knew spring might never come for them. The portents were darkening. Even Caesar, skeptical of augury, couldn't ignore the signs. A soothsayer named Spirina warned him to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia had nightmares of Caesar bleeding in her arms. Statues wept blood, or so people claimed. The air itself seemed charged with approaching catastrophe. The Senate scheduled a meeting for March 15, 44 BC. Important business needed addressing: Caesar's planned campaign against Parthia, the disposition of legions, various administrative matters. Caesar woke that morning with Calpurnia clutching his arm, begging him not to go. "I dreamed you were murdered," she whispered, her face pale. "Please stay home today. Send word you're ill. The Senate can wait." Caesar nearly agreed. He'd been feeling his age lately, the constant wars, the endless political maneuvering, the weight of holding together a fracturing world. He was 55 years old and tired in ways that sleep couldn't cure. What would one more day matter? But Mark Antony was waiting outside, and Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators, though Caesar didn't know it, arrived to urge him to attend. "The Senate is gathering to honor you," Decimus said. "They're prepared to grant you additional titles, to formally approve the Parthian campaign. Don't insult them with absence." Caesar looked at Calpurnia's terrified face, at the men waiting expectantly, at Rome spreading beyond his windows. He'd spent his entire life moving forward, never retreating, never showing weakness. To hide in his house because of dreams and omens would be to admit fear, to show vulnerability that enemies would exploit. "I'll go," he said, pulling away from Calpurnia's grasp. "These portents are superstition. I have work to do." He never saw Cleopatra again. She was at her villa when news came that Caesar had been assassinated, stabbed 23 times by senators wielding daggers, bleeding out at the feet of Pompey's statue in the Theater of Pompey where the Senate was meeting. Brutus had struck a blow, though not the fatal one. Cassius had organized it. Dozens had participated. The murder was both intensely personal and coldly political, a blood sacrifice to restore the Republic. Except it didn't restore anything. The Republic died with Caesar, though it took another 13 years of civil war to make that reality undeniable. Cleopatra heard the news and understood immediately what it meant. She was now the most vulnerable person in Rome, the foreign mistress of a murdered dictator, mother of his unacknowledged son, symbol of everything the conspirators claimed to oppose. If they came for her next, no one would protect her. The dictator's clemency had died with him. She left Rome within hours, taking Caesarion and her household and fleeing to the coast under cover of darkness. They sailed for Alexandria as soon as wind and tide allowed, racing ahead of the chaos that would consume Rome for more than a decade. Behind her, she left the man who loved her, who'd seen in her an intellectual equal and a political ally, who'd dreamed of building something new from the ruins of the old world. Behind her, Caesar lay dead, his blood soaking into Roman stones, his vision of transformation reduced to a corpse covered by a toga. The conspirators stood over him, some weeping despite themselves, others jubilant, all of them convinced they'd saved the Republic. They were wrong. What they'd saved was nothing. What they'd destroyed was the only man who might have managed Rome's transition from republic to empire without the bloodbath that was coming. But Cleopatra couldn't think about that as her ship cut through Mediterranean waters toward home. She could only hold Caesarion close and whisper promises she wasn't sure she could keep, that he was safe, that his father's death meant nothing for his future, that somehow they would survive what was coming. In her heart she knew better. Caesar's assassination had made her son both irrelevant and impossibly dangerous. Irrelevant because Caesar's will had named Octavian, not Caesarion, as his heir, a final rejection that stung more than she'd expected. Dangerous because anyone who wanted to challenge Octavian's legitimacy might use Caesarion as a rallying point, making the boy a target for assassination before he was old enough to understand why. She'd gambled everything on Caesar, her throne, her kingdom's independence, her personal happiness. For a few years, it had seemed like the gamble would pay off. They'd had months of happiness on the Nile, had created a child who might have united East and West, had dreamed of transforming the Mediterranean world into something greater than the sum of its parts. Now Caesar was dead, and those dreams had died with him. What remained was survival. Hers, her children's, Egypt's. She'd survived civil war and siege, had clawed her way back from exile and defeat. She would survive this too, somehow. But as Alexandria's harbors came into view, as the Pharos lighthouse guided her home, Cleopatra allowed herself one moment of grief. One moment to mourn not just the man, but the possibility, the brief, brilliant possibility that the world might have been different. Then she locked that grief away, assumed the mask of Pharaoh once more, and prepared to face whatever came next. She was 29 years old. She had decades ahead of her, decades to secure her kingdom and her children's futures, decades to navigate the chaos Caesar's death had unleashed. She couldn't know, standing on that ship's deck as Alexandria grew closer, that she had only 13 more years to live. That those years would bring another Roman, another love affair, another gamble that would end in catastrophic defeat. That she and Caesarion would both die by Roman hands, the boy murdered at Octavian's orders, the queen taking her own life rather than submit to capture. The future remained mercifully hidden. For now, she had Egypt, she had her son, and she had the memory of a man who treated her as an equal and changed her understanding of what was possible. It would have to be enough. #Part V, The Serpent's End. The years after Caesar's assassination passed like fever dreams, periods of frantic activity punctuated by stretches of anxious waiting, all of it overshadowed by the knowledge that Rome's chaos would eventually reach across the Mediterranean to Egypt's shores. Cleopatra had learned one fundamental truth from her time with Caesar: Rome's problems always became everyone's problems. The Republic's death throes would shake the entire known world before a new order emerged from the carnage. Initially, the conspirators believed they'd won. They'd struck down the tyrant, restored senatorial authority, saved the Republic. Marcus Brutus had addressed the crowd in the Forum with Cicero's fine rhetoric, explaining how necessary Caesar's death had been, how Rome was now free. The crowd had listened in stunned silence, neither approving nor condemning, and then drifted away to their homes as if unsure what freedom meant anymore. The confusion lasted perhaps 3 days. Then Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and consul, made his move. He seized Caesar's papers and his treasury, claimed to be executing Caesar's final wishes, and began systematically outmaneuvering the conspirators. The master stroke came at Caesar's funeral, where Antony displayed the dictator's bloody toga and read his will to the assembled masses. The will that left every Roman citizen a generous bequest, that gave his gardens across the Tiber to the people as a public park, that positioned Caesar not as tyrant but as benefactor. The crowd erupted. What had been confusion transformed into rage. The conspirators fled Rome as mobs burned their houses and hunted them through the streets. Brutus and Cassius escaped to the eastern provinces, where they began raising armies. Rome lurched toward yet another civil war, this one ostensibly about avenging Caesar but really about who would inherit his power. Cleopatra watched from Alexandria and calculated. The obvious bet was on Mark Antony. He had Caesar's name, his veterans, his political machinery. But there was another player, one most observers dismissed, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew, whom the dictators will named as adopted son and primary heir. Octavian was everything Caesar hadn't been. Small, sickly, unproven in battle, lacking his great-uncle's charisma and martial genius. But he had two things that mattered: Caesar's name and an absolute, ruthless determination to inherit Caesar's world. Cleopatra had met him once, briefly, when he'd visited Caesar in Rome. She'd dismissed him as a boy playing at politics, a tool that Antony would use and discard. She would not make that mistake again. The second triumvirate formed in 43 BC, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus dividing the Roman world among themselves and launching a proscription that made Sulla's purges look merciful. Thousands died, including Cicero, whose eloquent tongue couldn't save him from Antony's vengeance. The conspirators were hunted down and destroyed at Philippi, Brutus falling on his sword in the tradition of defeated Roman generals. Through all of this, Egypt remained neutral, or tried to. Cleopatra had sent 4 legions to support the triumvirate against the conspirators, but they'd been diverted by other players and never reached the battlefield. This ambiguity was dangerous. It meant she hadn't actively opposed the triumvirate, but neither had she effectively supported them. In the brutal arithmetic of civil war, such neutrality was often interpreted as betrayal. When the summons came from Mark Antony in 41 BC, Cleopatra knew she was being called to account. Antony had taken the eastern provinces as his share of the Roman world and was headquartered in Tarsus, Cilicia. He wanted to discuss Egypt's role in the recent conflicts, to ensure her loyalty going forward, to settle questions about tribute and cooperation. The message was polite, but the threat underneath was unmistakable. Come and explain yourself, or be treated as an enemy. Cleopatra was 30 years old now, hardened by a decade of political survival, no longer the desperate girl who'd smuggled herself to Caesar in a carpet. She'd ruled Egypt through war and peace, had borne 2 more children, twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, fathered by Caesar though officially attributed to Egyptian nobles to avoid complications. She'd rebuilt Alexandria's economy, strengthened the army, and maintained Egypt's independence while most of the Mediterranean burned. She was not about to be summoned like a provincial governor reporting to a superior. If Antony wanted to meet, they would meet as equals, monarch to monarch, power to power. And she would remind him, and through him all of Rome, that Egypt was not some minor kingdom to be absorbed and exploited. The barge she took up the Cydnus River to Tarsus was a statement of intent, a floating exhibition of Egyptian wealth and sophistication that made the vessels she'd shown Caesar look modest by comparison. The sails were purple silk, worth more than most men earned in a lifetime. The deck was laid with cloth of gold. The oars were silver, actual silver, gleaming in the sunlight. Incense burned in braziers, perfuming the air so that people on shore could smell the procession before they saw it. And Cleopatra herself appeared as Venus, or Isis Aphrodite in the syncretic theology that blended Greek and Egyptian divinities, reclining beneath a canopy sewn with gold thread, attended by boys dressed as cupids with fans, served by women costumed as nymphs and graces. It was theater of the highest order, a performance designed to communicate that Egypt's queen was not some supplicant, but a divine figure descending to treat with mortals. The entire city turned out to watch. Even Antony's soldiers, veterans of a dozen campaigns, stood gaping at the spectacle. And Antony himself, who'd been sitting in his tribunal waiting for Cleopatra to come grovel, found his audience deserting him as everyone rushed to the riverbank to witness this vision sailing toward them. Antony was 42 years old, a massive man who'd been Caesar's right hand for years. He was everything Octavian wasn't, physically imposing, brave in battle, loved by soldiers, capable of great charm when he chose to deploy it. He was also self-indulgent, temperamental, and prone to mistakes that a more disciplined leader would have avoided. Caesar had valued him as a subordinate but never quite trusted him with independent authority. Now, watching this impossible spectacle sail toward his headquarters, Antony felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine surprise. He'd expected Cleopatra to come making excuses, to plead poverty, or explain away her equivocal support during the civil wars. Instead, she turned her arrival into a triumph that overshadowed his own authority. "Clever," he murmured to his aide. "Very clever. She's making me come to her." And he did. That evening, Antony went aboard Cleopatra's barge for a banquet that would become legendary. The food was exquisite, the wine flowed freely, and the entertainment was carefully calculated to impress without overwhelming. But the real performance was Cleopatra herself, charming, witty, fluent in Latin with that Greek accent that somehow made everything she said more interesting, capable of discussing military strategy or philosophy with equal facility. She'd learned from her time with Caesar. She knew what Roman commanders wanted, not just beauty, though she was beautiful enough, but intelligence, conversation, someone who understood power and wasn't afraid of it. Antony had spent years around camp followers and provincial noblewomen who simpered and flattered. Cleopatra treated him as an equal, challenged his opinions, made him work for her approval. He was enchanted. Over the following days, as negotiations supposedly about Egyptian tribute and military support devolved into something more personal, Antony found himself increasingly under Cleopatra's spell. She was everything his Roman wife Fulvia wasn't: exotic, mysterious, undemanding in the ways that mattered while being intensely present in others. She listened to his war stories without the glazed expression most civilians showed. She understood logistics, supply lines, the realities of commanding armies across vast distances. She was also, though Antony didn't fully realize it yet, playing a much deeper game. Cleopatra had studied Roman politics for a decade now. She understood that the triumvirate was unstable, that eventually Antony and Octavian would clash for supremacy. When that happened, she needed to be positioned as Antony's indispensable ally, the one Eastern power that could provide the resources necessary to defeat Octavian. The affair that began in Tarsus was genuine. Cleopatra did love Antony, in her way, though it was a different love than what she'd felt for Caesar. Caesar had been her intellectual match, the brilliant mind that challenged and stimulated her. Antony was warmer, more emotional, more human in his flaws and passions. Where Caesar had been marble, Antony was flesh. Where Caesar had planned civilizations, Antony lived in the moment. But genuine feeling didn't preclude strategic calculation. Cleopatra could love Antony and use him simultaneously. She'd learned that lesson in a harder school than most people could imagine. They spent the winter of 41 to 40 BC in Alexandria, and for a few months it seemed like the past had returned. Antony threw himself into Egyptian life with the enthusiasm of a man escaping Roman responsibilities. He and Cleopatra founded a drinking society called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to pleasure and excess. They gambled in the streets disguised as common people, played elaborate pranks, hosted parties that scandalized even Alexandria's jaded elite. But beneath the revelry, serious matters progressed. Cleopatra bore Antony twins, another Alexander and another Cleopatra, adding to the family she was building. More importantly, she negotiated a new relationship between Egypt and Rome's eastern territories. Antony, besotted and generous, restored territories that previous Roman commanders had stripped from Egypt. Phoenicia, Coele-Syria, Cyprus, parts of Crete and Cyrene, all returned to Egyptian control, rebuilding the kingdom to something approaching its Ptolemaic glory. In Rome, Octavian watched and calculated. His propaganda machine began portraying Antony as a man bewitched, a Roman general going native, abandoning his duties for Eastern luxury and a foreign queen's bed. The message was carefully crafted. Antony was becoming another Caesar, but worse, Caesar had at least kept his foreign entanglement discreet. Antony was flaunting his relationship with Cleopatra, having children with her, transferring Roman territories to her control. The propaganda would have been more effective if Antony had stayed in Alexandria. But Rome's problems couldn't be ignored forever. His wife Fulvia and his brother had launched a rebellion against Octavian in Italy, forcing Antony to return and sort out the mess. He left Cleopatra in the spring of 40 BC, promising to return soon, and immediately got swept back into Roman politics. For the next 4 years, Cleopatra barely saw him. Antony made peace with Octavian, married Octavian's sister Octavia in a political alliance, fathered children with her, and generally acted like a Roman commander with Roman responsibilities. He campaigned in Parthia, suffering devastating defeats that showed he was no Caesar when it came to military genius. He administered the eastern provinces with reasonable competence but no particular brilliance. And he thought about Alexandria, about Cleopatra, about the twins growing up without their father, about Caesarion, now a young man being groomed to rule, about a life that had felt more vivid and real than anything Rome offered. Cleopatra waited. She rebuilt Egypt's economy, strengthened its military, prepared for what she knew was coming. The final confrontation between Antony and Octavian was inevitable. The triumvirate had always been a temporary expedient, and Lepidus had already been pushed aside. Eventually it would come down to 2 men fighting for Caesar's legacy, and when it did, Egypt needed to be ready to throw its full weight behind Antony. They reunited in Antioch in 37 BC, and it was as if the intervening years hadn't happened. Antony looked older, worn down by failures in Parthia and the endless grind of Roman politics. But with Cleopatra he could be himself, could drop the performance of Roman gravitas, and simply be Marcus Antonius, a man who'd survived more battles than he could count and was tired of fighting. "I should never have left," he told her on their first night together. "Alexandria was the only place I've been happy since Caesar died." "Then don't leave again," Cleopatra replied simply. "Make your headquarters here. Rule the East from Egypt. Let Octavian have Rome, what does it matter? The wealth is here, the trade routes, the civilizations that were ancient when Rome was founded. Why struggle for control of a decaying city when you could have all of this?" It was seductive reasoning, and Antony knew it was also strategic. If he based himself permanently in Egypt, he'd be increasingly isolated from Roman power centers, increasingly dependent on Cleopatra's resources and support. But he was also tired of Roman politics, tired of Octavian's cold manipulations, tired of pretending he wanted to return to a wife he'd married for political convenience. The decision was made gradually, through 1,000 small choices that accumulated into an irreversible commitment. Antony began styling himself as Dionysus Osiris, adopting Eastern religious symbolism that horrified Rome. He publicly acknowledged his children with Cleopatra, giving them titles and territories. He made Alexandria his capital, treating Rome as a distant province rather than the center of his world. And in 34 BC, after a successful campaign in Armenia, he held a triumph in Alexandria rather than Rome, a calculated insult to Roman tradition that played directly into Octavian's propaganda. The ceremony, called the Donations of Alexandria, saw Antony distribute territories across the eastern Mediterranean to Cleopatra and their children, presenting her as Queen of Kings, and Caesarion as King of Kings. It was magnificent theater, but it was also political suicide. Rome could tolerate a general keeping a foreign mistress. Rome could overlook children born outside legal marriage. But Rome could not accept a Roman commander essentially creating an Eastern empire with a foreign queen as co-ruler, distributing Roman territories like personal property, performing Roman religious ceremonies in foreign cities. Octavian, watching from Rome, knew his moment had come. He petitioned the Senate to declare war, not on Antony, not yet, but on Cleopatra. Let it be framed as Rome defending itself against a foreign queen's ambitions, against an Eastern threat to Roman independence. The Senate, still technically functioning though utterly subordinate to Octavian's will, agreed. War was declared in 32 BC, and both sides spent the following year preparing for the confrontation that would determine the Mediterranean's future. Antony gathered his forces, Roman legions that had served him for years, supplemented by auxiliary troops from across the eastern provinces, supported by Egypt's wealth and Cleopatra's fleet. The numbers looked good on paper, somewhere between 70 and 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and a fleet of perhaps 500 ships. Octavian's forces were smaller but better positioned. He held Italy, which meant he controlled Rome's symbolic heart. His general Marcus Agrippa was a military genius, possibly the finest admiral alive. And Octavian himself, though no soldier, was a master of logistics and propaganda. While Antony drank with Cleopatra in Alexandria, Octavian's agents were working to undermine morale in Antony's army, spreading rumors that Antony planned to move Rome's capital to Alexandria, that he intended to make Cleopatra Empress of Rome, that he'd abandoned Roman traditions entirely. The campaign season of 31 BC opened with both armies maneuvering around Greece. Antony took up a defensive position at Actium on the western coast, intending to force Octavian into a costly assault or naval battle. But Agrippa blockaded the position, cutting off supplies, and Antony's army began to disintegrate from disease and desertion. Romans in Antony's ranks increasingly questioned why they were fighting for an Egyptian queen against other Romans. The Battle of Actium, fought on September 2, 31 BC, was less a battle than a disaster. Antony's fleet engaged Agrippa's ships in the waters off Actium, but the fighting was half-hearted, the crews demoralized. Then, in the middle of the engagement, Cleopatra's squadron, 60 Egyptian ships, broke off from the battle line and sailed for open water, heading south toward Egypt. Antony, seeing her ships departing, abandoned his fleet and followed in a fast galley. Whether this was a prearranged retreat or Cleopatra panicking is something historians would debate for centuries. What mattered was the result. Antony's fleet surrendered or was destroyed. His army gave up without serious resistance, and the war was effectively over in a single afternoon. The flight back to Alexandria was a journey through despair. Antony spent the first 3 days sitting alone at the ship's prow, refusing to speak to anyone, including Cleopatra. When he finally emerged, he was a broken man. The general who'd commanded legions, who'd been Caesar's right hand, who'd once held half the Roman world, he was reduced to a fugitive fleeing the consequences of his own failures. They reached Alexandria in early autumn to find the city preparing for siege. Octavian would come, that was certain. The only questions were when and what terms he'd offer. Antony tried to rally resistance, but his heart wasn't in it. He established a new drinking society, calling it the Partners in Death, which told everyone what he really believed about their chances. Cleopatra, characteristically, refused to give up. She began secret negotiations with Octavian through intermediaries, trying to find some arrangement that would preserve Egypt's independence and her children's lives. She offered treasure, alliance, anything Octavian wanted, except submission. She would not kneel. She would not see Egypt reduced to a Roman province, its wealth stripped away to feed Rome's appetite. Octavian's responses were carefully non-committal. He made no promises, offered no guarantees. He simply advanced, methodically conquering Egypt's border fortresses, tightening the noose. When he finally reached Alexandria in July of 30 BC, Antony made one last attempt at resistance, a cavalry charge that briefly pushed back Octavian's forces before collapsing as Antony's men deserted en masse to the winning side. The end came in a confusion of misinformation and tragedy. Cleopatra, fearing Antony might surrender her to save himself, retreated to the mausoleum she'd built for herself and sent word to Antony that she was dead. Antony, hearing this, fell on his sword, but botched even suicide, the blade failing to strike immediately fatal. He was still alive when word came that Cleopatra actually lived, still drawing breath when he was carried to her mausoleum, too badly wounded to climb the stairs. Cleopatra and her servants hauled him up through a window using ropes, refusing to open the barred doors for fear of Roman soldiers forcing entry. Antony died in her arms, bleeding out in the very tomb she'd prepared for herself, his last words a mixture of love and regret. He'd been 53 years old, had survived 100 battles, and died from a self-inflicted wound in the arms of a woman he'd loved but couldn't save. Cleopatra had perhaps 3 days left. Octavian's forces secured the mausoleum, taking her prisoner but treating her with respect. She was, after all, still Queen of Egypt, and Octavian wanted her to appear in his triumph in Rome. The propaganda value of parading Egypt's queen through Roman streets in chains would be immense. But Cleopatra had learned from her father's example. Ptolemy XII had humiliated himself before Rome, had bought his throne with Egyptian gold, had died despised by his own people. She would not follow that path. She would not be displayed as a trophy, would not give Octavian the satisfaction of her humiliation. The exact method of her death remains debated. Ancient sources claim she died from an asp's bite, a cobra smuggled into her chamber hidden in a basket of figs. Modern scholars question this, suggesting poison was more likely, possibly concealed in a hair comb. What matters is that on August 12, 30 BC, Cleopatra VII Philopator died by her own hand, still wearing her royal regalia, still seated on her throne. She was 39 years old. She'd ruled Egypt for 22 years, had survived civil war and siege, had loved 2 of Rome's greatest men, had borne children who carried both Egyptian and Roman blood. She'd come within reach of creating something unprecedented, a true partnership between East and West, a hybrid civilization that might have changed history. Instead, she became history's most famous suicide, the last pharaoh of an independent Egypt, a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and foreign entanglements. Octavian had Caesar Ion, now 17 years old, hunted down and murdered. "Too many Caesars is not a good thing," he reportedly said, quoting his tutor. The other children, Antony and Cleopatra's twins and their younger son Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared, raised in Rome by Octavian's sister Octavia. They survived but vanished from history, absorbed into Roman families, their Egyptian heritage erased. Egypt became a Roman province, its immense wealth flowing to Rome, its grain feeding the capital's 1,000,000 inhabitants. The Ptolemaic dynasty ended after 3 centuries of rule. The age of independent Eastern kingdoms was over. Rome, transformed into empire under Octavian, who would rename himself Augustus, dominated the Mediterranean for the next 500 years. And in Alexandria, in the mausoleum where Cleopatra had chosen death over surrender, they laid her beside Antony in the tomb she'd prepared for herself. The 2 lovers who defied Rome were buried together, united in death, as they never quite managed to be in life. The Library of Alexandria, damaged in Caesar's siege and never fully recovered, would decline further under Roman rule, finally destroyed in stages over the following centuries. The learning and culture that had made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the ancient world gradually dissipated. Egypt itself became a backwater, valued only for its agricultural output, its glorious past forgotten or distorted by foreign conquerors. But the story of Caesar and Cleopatra, the aging Roman general and the brilliant young queen, the brief moment when it seemed like they might actually change the world, that story endured. It was told and retold, embellished and romanticized, transformed into legend. Shakespeare wrote his plays. Hollywood made its films. Artists painted their visions of how it must have been. Most of these versions got it wrong in important ways. They focused on the romance, the passion, the dramatic deaths. They missed the political calculation, the intellectual partnership, the serious attempt to create something new from the ruins of the old Hellenistic kingdoms and the emerging Roman Empire. Caesar and Cleopatra weren't star-crossed lovers doomed by fate. They were intelligent, ambitious people who saw possibilities others couldn't imagine and took enormous risks to achieve them. They failed ultimately, both dead before their time, their visions unrealized, their children scattered or murdered. But they failed grandly, attempting something unprecedented in human history, a genuine partnership of equals across the vast divides of gender, culture, and age. In the mausoleum where Cleopatra chose the asp over humiliation, in the forum where Caesar bled out at Pompey's feet, in the waters off Actium where the last chance of their shared dream died, in all these places, the ancient world transformed into something new. Not the world Caesar and Cleopatra had envisioned, but one shaped by their attempts and failures. Rome became empire. Egypt became province. The Republic died and took with it any pretense that popular sovereignty or senatorial wisdom governed the Mediterranean. What emerged was autocracy, enlightened sometimes, brutal often, but always concentrated in the hands of one man claiming authority from the divine. Octavian, having destroyed Antony and Cleopatra, having absorbed Egypt and crushed all opposition, would rule for another 44 years as Augustus, first emperor of Rome. He would bring peace, the Pax Romana, and prosperity. He would build monuments and write laws. He would be deified after death, starting a tradition of emperor worship that would last centuries. But sometimes, in his old age, did Augustus think about the woman whose death had secured his power? Did he wonder what she'd been like, this Cleopatra who'd captivated both Caesar and Antony, who'd held Egypt together through impossible circumstances, who'd chosen death rather than submit? Did he ever regret that she couldn't be allowed to live, that her intelligence and capability had to be sacrificed to the necessities of Roman politics? The sources don't tell us. Augustus left no memoirs discussing his feelings about Cleopatra. He erased her memory where he could, destroyed her monuments, forbade mention of her achievements. She became, in Roman historical memory, a dangerous foreign seductress who'd corrupted good Roman men, a narrative that served Augustus's purposes but missed everything important about who she actually was. The truth was simpler and more profound. Cleopatra was a ruler fighting for her kingdom's survival in an age when independence was becoming impossible, when the Mediterranean world was consolidating under Roman power whether anyone liked it or not. She chose love twice, genuine love, not just political alliance, and tried to transform those personal connections into something that might save her kingdom. It didn't work. Rome was too powerful, too inevitable. The age of independent Hellenistic kingdoms was ending regardless of what any individual did. Cleopatra's tragedy wasn't that she chose poorly or loved unwisely. Her tragedy was that she was born into a world that was dying, and no amount of intelligence or courage or political skill could prevent that death. But she tried. Gods, how she tried. And in the trying, she created a story that would echo through the centuries, a reminder that even in ages of transition and collapse, individuals matter. That love and ambition and intelligence can shake empires, even if they can't ultimately redirect history's great currents. In the mausoleum in Alexandria, where Cleopatra lay beside Antony, the ancient world's last pharaoh rested at last. The struggles were over. The calculations were done. The games of empire had reached their final move. And somewhere in the darkness, perhaps, Caesar's ghost kept watch over them both. The woman who'd emerged from a carpet to claim her throne, the general who'd loved her well if not wisely, and the dream they'd all shared of a world transformed. The dream had died. But the story would never die. It would echo through 2,000 years of human civilization, inspiring poets and painters, politicians and dreamers, anyone who ever wondered what might have been if the world had taken a different turn at that crucial moment when Rome met Egypt and found, briefly, something worth preserving. That was the true gift of Caesar and Cleopatra, not what they achieved, which was ultimately ephemeral, but what they showed was possible. That intellect and passion could combine. That East and West could meet as equals. That love, even in the brutal world of ancient politics, could be genuine and transformative. The Roman Empire would last 500 years. The Byzantine Empire would endure another 1,000 after that. But the brief moment when Caesar and Cleopatra tried to build something different, that moment was unique. It would never come again.